In the autumn of 1943, a funeral was held for Edsel Ford, the only son of Henry Ford, president of the Ford Motor Company, and by most accounts the more quietly capable of the two men whose names appeared on the same building. The service was attended by hundreds. Detroit's industrialists came, politicians came. The press noted the flowers, the cars parked along the drive, the weight of the occasion. Eleanor Ford sat through it in the way that women of her position had been trained to sit through things, upright, composed, dressed correctly. She was 50 years old, and she had been married to Edsel for 27 years. She had borne him 4 children. She had managed his homes, attended his obligations, and watched across the length of their marriage as his father systematically refused to let him run the company that bore their shared name. Now Edsel was gone, dead of stomach cancer at 49, though those close to him had other explanations for what had worn him down. And Eleanor was left inside a structure that had no clear place for her. Her father-in-law was still alive. Her eldest son was 25. The company would continue without meaningful pause. Somewhere in the same city, her sister-in-law Josephine moved through a life that had grown steadily quieter, steadily smaller, in ways that do not appear cleanly in the historical record. This is not a story about two women who overcame the constraints placed on them. It is a story about what those constraints looked like from the inside, and what they left behind when they were finally lifted, which was, in most cases, very little. The Ford Motor Company was incorporated in June of 1903. Eleanor Clay was born in 1896. Josephine Ford was born in 1899. These dates are not incidental. By the time either girl was old enough to understand what her family represented, the Ford name was already something larger than a family. It was a commercial fact, a national symbol, and increasingly, an ideology. Eleanor was not born a Ford. She was born a Clay, the niece of Joseph L. Hudson, the department store magnate whose name still sits above the memory of what was once Detroit's most prominent retail institution. Her family had money before she married into the Ford line. She was not arriving from nothing when she became Edsel's wife in 1916. This matters because it means Eleanor entered the Ford world with some prior sense of herself, a self formed elsewhere under different pressures. And yet, that prior self becomes difficult to locate in the decades that follow. What she brought in with her was gradually subsumed by what she married into. Josephine was different in origin. She was born a Ford, Henry and Clara's granddaughter, Edsel's sister, a Ford by blood rather than by contract. Where Eleanor came to the family name through a ceremony, Josephine was issued it at birth. She grew up at Fair Lane, the estate Henry Ford built on the River Rouge in Dearborn, Michigan, completed in 1915 when Josephine was 16. The house had 56 rooms. It had its own power plant. It had gardens designed to Henry's specifications, which meant they reflected Henry's preferences, not Clara's, not Josephine's, not anyone else's. To grow up at Fair Lane was to grow up inside someone else's vision of what a home should be. Henry Ford had opinions about almost everything: food, music, labor, history, the moral character of different ethnic groups. And those opinions were not kept separate from domestic life. They were the atmosphere of domestic life. Josephine did not have to read her father's public statements to absorb his worldview. She absorbed it at the dinner table, in the organization of the household staff, in which guests were welcomed and which were quietly not invited back. Henry Ford's anti-Semitism was not a private eccentricity that his family managed to keep at arm's length. It was published. Between 1920 and 1922, his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, ran a series of articles collected under the title The International Jew. The series ran to 91 issues. It was later translated into German and, according to various historical accounts, kept in visible esteem by figures in the Nazi movement. Henry Ford received the Grand Cross of the German Eagle from the Nazi government in 1938, the highest honor Germany could bestow on a foreign civilian. He accepted it. Josephine was 39 years old when her father accepted that medal. Eleanor was 42. Neither woman made a public statement about it. This is not surprising. Women in their position did not make public statements about their fathers or fathers-in-law. But the silence is not neutral. It sits in the record, undisturbed. What Eleanor and Josephine understood about their family's ideology, and when they understood it, And what they chose to do with that understanding is something the historical record does not resolve cleanly. What it does show is that both women continued to operate inside the Ford institutional world, attending its events, lending their names to its philanthropies, living in its houses. Throughout the period when the Ford name carried specific and documented associations that extended well beyond automobiles. Eleanor's childhood in the Clay household had given her a taste for art. Her Uncle Hudson's commercial success had produced a family comfortable with culture as a form of social currency. And Eleanor arrived in the Ford family with genuine aesthetic interests that were somewhat unusual in that environment. Henry Ford was famously indifferent to fine art. He was interested in folk music, in square dancing, in the machinery of American vernacular life. Things he could frame as authentically American, uncontaminated by what he regarded as foreign influence. The Detroit Institute of Arts, which would become one of Eleanor's central philanthropic commitments, was not a natural extension of the Ford domestic sensibility. It was something she brought from elsewhere and maintained almost in despite of it. Josephine's interior life in these years is harder to reconstruct. She appears in family photographs, a young woman with her parents' angular features, formally dressed, standing in configurations that suggest occasion rather than ease. She was educated, as Eleanor had been, in the manner considered appropriate for women of their class and period. Enough learning to converse, enough accomplishment to perform, not enough of either to become professionally inconvenient. She was presented to society. She was expected to marry well. The question of what she might have wanted beyond those expectations does not surface in the documents her family preserved. By the time Josephine was in her early 20s, her brother Edsel had already married Eleanor and begun producing the grandchildren Henry Ford had been waiting for. The family structure was consolidating around Edsel's line. Josephine's role within that structure was becoming less defined, not more. She was the daughter, not the son. She was not going to inherit the company. She was not going to run anything. She would marry, and her husband would be evaluated by her father, and her life would proceed inside the parameters that evaluation allowed. In 1923, Josephine married Walter Boole Ford II, a man whose surname was already Ford, which made the marriage something of a closed circuit within Detroit's industrial aristocracy. The families knew each other, the names were compatible. Whether Josephine was happy in the early years of that marriage is not something the record specifies. What it specifies is that the marriage produced children, that it continued, and that Josephine's public presence after it became gradually, measurably smaller. Eleanor's life in the same period was moving in the opposite direction, outward, into rooms full of art and obligation, and the specific social performance required of a woman married to the president of the Ford Motor Company. She was acquiring, not just objects, though she was acquiring those too, but roles: trustee, donor, patron, host. Each role added a layer of public identity. Each layer made the woman underneath it slightly harder to see. The machine the Ford name had built was not only industrial, it was social, architectural, institutional. Eleanor and Josephine had been born into it or married into it before they were old enough to understand what living inside a machine actually costs. By the time they might have understood, the cost was already running. Henry Ford turned 60 in 1923. By that point, he had been famous for nearly 2 decades, not merely wealthy, but culturally dominant in a way that very few industrialists managed to become. He had opinions about wages, about history, about the moral character of cities, about what Americans should eat and how they should spend their leisure hours. Those opinions were not confined to interviews or speeches. They organized the world his family lived in. Fair Lane was completed in 1915, and it was Henry's house in every meaningful sense. Clara Ford had preferences. She was known to be a careful and attentive woman, more socially graceful than her husband, more attuned to the feelings of the people around her. But the estate was built according to Henry's directives. He wanted a power plant. He wanted a specific relationship between the house and the river. He wanted the grounds managed in ways that reflected his ideas about nature, which were less about beauty than about control. The landscape at Fair Lane was not wild. It was organized. Things grew where Henry Ford decided they should grow. Josephine grew up inside that organization. She ate the food Henry approved of. He had strong views about diet, favoring simple American fare and harboring suspicion of anything he associated with foreign influence or urban sophistication. She heard the music he preferred, which was old-time American folk music. He hired an orchestra to play at Fair Lane and specified the repertoire. Square dancing was a regular feature of Ford family social life, not because the family had spontaneously developed a taste for it, but because Henry had decided it was wholesome, authentically American, and preferable to the jazz that was becoming popular in Detroit's less controlled social environments. Henry Ford's distrust of jazz was not separable from his broader views about race and culture. His published writings made clear that he regarded jazz as a corrupting influence, and his identification of that corruption with Jewish commercial influence was explicit in the pages of the Dearborn Independent. This was the ideological atmosphere in which Josephine Ford spent her adolescence and early adulthood. It was not something she encountered in a newspaper or heard about secondhand. It was the water. Edsel Ford's position in this environment was, by the accounts of those who observed the family closely, genuinely painful. He was capable. More capable, many believed, than his father in the areas that would matter most to the company's future. He had taste and judgment. He understood design in ways Henry did not and did not pretend to. He wanted to modernize the company's product line at moments when Henry resisted modernization. He wanted to build relationships with labor that might forestall the violence Henry was willing to use against union organizers. He was, in nearly every documented disagreement with his father, on the side of the decision that subsequent history has judged to be correct. Henry overruled him systematically over the course of decades. The specific mechanism of that overruling is important. Henry did not simply disagree with Edsel and implement his own preference instead. He humiliated him. He would agree to a decision Edsel had made, and then quietly reverse it without telling his son. He brought in Harry Bennett, a former boxer with connections to organized crime who ran Ford's internal security apparatus, and gave Bennett authority that cut across Edsel's legitimate organizational role. Bennett reported directly to Henry and made clear to everyone inside the company that Edsel's instructions could be superseded. Edsel would give an order. Bennett would countermand it. Henry would say nothing. Eleanor watched this happen across the full length of her marriage. She had married a man who was, on paper, the president of one of the most powerful companies in the world, and she lived with the daily reality that this title did not correspond to actual authority. The question of what this did to Edsel is documented. His health deteriorated. His stomach cancer was diagnosed in the early 1940s, and people who knew him attributed his physical decline in part to the sustained stress of his position. The question of what it did to Eleanor is less directly recorded. What the record shows is that Eleanor and Henry Ford did not have a warm relationship. This is stated carefully in the sources that address it. The language tends toward phrases like not close or reserved with one another, but the outlines of the tension are legible. Eleanor had come from a family with its own money and its own social standing. She was not intimidated by wealth as such. She had aesthetic commitments that were genuinely her own and that Henry found alien. She watched what Henry did to her husband, and she could not have been indifferent to it. But she had 4 children, a position, a set of obligations, and a father-in-law, who was still, throughout Edsel's presidency, the dominant force inside the company and inside the family's public identity. In 1932, Henry Ford made a decision that illustrated with unusual clarity where his priorities lay. The Ford Hunger March took place on March 7th of that year. Several thousand unemployed workers, many of them former Ford employees, marched toward the River Rouge plant to present a list of demands. Ford's security forces, under Bennett's direction, met them with tear gas and then with live fire. 4 marchers were killed. Dozens were injured. The bodies of the dead were displayed at a public funeral attended by thousands, and a banner over the coffins named Henry Ford as responsible. Edsel Ford was alive during the Hunger March. Eleanor was alive during it. Josephine was alive during it. The family continued to live in its estates, continued to attend its obligations, continued to operate inside the Ford institutional world without public rupture. This is not a unique response. Families embedded in industrial power have consistently found ways to maintain psychological distance from the violence that power requires. But the distance required active maintenance. It did not come free. Henry Ford suffered a series of strokes beginning in 1938. His mental capacities declined noticeably after each one, and by the early 1940s, people inside the company were describing him as erratic and sometimes irrational. He became more dependent on Bennett, whose influence expanded as Henry's coherence contracted. Edsel, already ill, was attempting to manage a company increasingly held hostage by a security enforcer whose authority derived entirely from a deteriorating old man's loyalty. Edsel died in May of 1943. He was 49. Henry Ford, 80 years old and significantly diminished, was pressed back into the presidency of his own company because the institutional structure had no other immediate option. He held the title for 2 years, during which the company's management problems deepened considerably. Josephine had watched her brother's diminishment from a position that gave her no formal leverage over any of it. She was a Ford daughter, then a Ford wife, married to a man whose Ford surname was inherited rather than earned through the company. And the decisions being made about Edsel, about the company, about Bennett, were not hers to influence. The family's internal governance was not structured to include her opinion. What both women understood about their father and father-in-law by the time of Edsel's death is suggested by their subsequent behavior more than by anything they said directly. Eleanor moved with deliberate speed to ensure that Henry Ford II, her eldest son, 25 years old, was released from the Navy and installed at the company before Henry Sr. could make further decisions about its direction. She worked the channels available to her. She was effective. Henry II took over in September of 1945. It was one of the few moments in Eleanor Ford's life when the outcome she wanted and the outcome that occurred were the same thing. That it required her husband's death and her father-in-law's incapacitation to create the opening says something about the architecture of the world she had been living inside. In 1910, Eleanor Clay was 14 years old and enrolled in the kind of school that existed specifically for girls of her economic position. The curriculum was not designed to produce women who would enter professions, manage institutions, or exercise independent intellectual authority. It was designed to produce women who would be recognizable as educated, who could discuss a painting, read French with acceptable fluency, play an instrument with competence, if not distinction, and move through formal social situations without embarrassing themselves or their families. The education was, in its deepest function, a form of packaging. This was not unusual. It was the norm for women of Eleanor's class and generation across the industrialized world. The assumption embedded in that curriculum that a woman's learning was instrumental, that it served her social utility rather than her own development, was so thoroughly naturalized that it rarely required articulation. Girls absorbed it the way they absorbed table manners. It was simply the shape of things. What made Eleanor's case somewhat distinct was that she arrived at her education with genuine curiosity. The accounts of those who knew her in later life consistently describe a woman with real aesthetic intelligence, not the performed appreciation of someone who had learned to say the right things about art, but actual engagement, actual preference, actual judgment. She could look at a painting and have a response to it that was her own. This is not as common as it sounds, even among people who spend their lives adjacent to art. Eleanor had it, and the education she received gave her just enough exposure to the world of art and culture to activate that capacity, and then pointed her firmly toward marriage. She met Edsel Ford through the social circuits that connected Detroit's wealthy families. He was 21, she was 19, and the match was considered appropriate on every visible dimension. Edsel was cultured by the standards of his background, more so than his father, whose tastes ran toward the mechanical and the folkloric. He and Eleanor shared a genuine interest in art that would, over the course of their marriage, express itself in serious collecting and in their sustained relationship with the Detroit Institute of Arts. In this one respect, the marriage aligned Eleanor's capacities with something real, but it also absorbed those capacities entirely into a shared project that was legible to the world primarily as his project attached to his name, housed in his institutional relationships. Josephine's education followed a similar pattern with fewer of Eleanor's compensating factors. She was educated at home and in private schools. in ways the record does not detail extensively. What it shows is that she was not directed toward any particular intellectual or professional development. She was Edsel Ford's younger sister, Henry Ford's daughter, a position that required certain social performances and precluded others. The question of what Josephine might have been interested in, outside the parameters of that position, is one the historical record does not answer clearly. She left fewer traces than Eleanor. The traces she left tend to be social rather than intellectual. Attendance at events, presence in photographs, her name on charitable committees. There is a specific kind of erasure that happens to women in this position. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It works through accumulation, through the slow replacement of individual preference with institutional role, through the gradual substitution of social function for interior life. By the time a woman in Josephine's situation was in her 30s, the question of what she had originally wanted, or thought, or preferred, had often become genuinely difficult to reconstruct. Not because she had been prevented from having preferences, but because the structures around her had consistently offered her so few occasions to exercise them that the preferences themselves had grown indistinct. Eleanor's aesthetic education, limited as it was, gave her a language, however constrained, for one domain of her own experience. She could talk about paintings, she could make acquisition decisions, she could, within the specific universe of art patronage, exercise something that resembled judgment. Josephine did not appear to have an equivalent domain. This is not a statement about Josephine's intelligence or capacity. It is a statement about what the education available to her had equipped her to do in public. In 1916, Eleanor married Edsel at a ceremony that was covered by the Detroit press as a social event of considerable significance. She was 20 years old. The marriage moved her immediately and completely into the Ford institutional world. Her previous identity, as a Clay, as a Hudson niece, as a young woman with her own aesthetic interests and her own family's money, did not disappear, but it was reorganized around her new position. She became, in the social grammar of Detroit, Edsel Ford's wife. That was the primary noun. Everything else became modifying. The education she had received had prepared her for exactly this reorganization. It had given her the skills to perform the role of a prominent industrialist's wife, to host, to attend, to speak appropriately at public occasions, to represent the family's cultural standing through involvement in the right institutions. It had not given her tools to resist the reorganization or to maintain a separate public identity alongside it, or to build a professional life that existed independently of Edsel's. Those tools had not been on the curriculum. What Eleanor did with the materials available to her was, by any reasonable measure, considerable. She became genuinely knowledgeable about art. She built a collection, with Edsel and through her own developing judgment, that is now regarded as one of the significant private collections of its era. She gave to the Detroit Institute of Arts in ways that shaped the institution's holdings in lasting ways. These are real achievements, but they were achievements that required her to work entirely within the structures available to her, and those structures were designed to make her contributions legible primarily as support for institutions run by others, donations to buildings named for other people, patronage rather than practice. Josephine's life after marriage moved in a direction that suggests the education she received had left her with fewer resources for that kind of lateral translation. She did not develop a public philanthropic identity on Eleanor's scale. She did not become known as a patron of a particular institution or domain. She had children. She had a household. She had the social obligations that came with her name. The record of what she did inside those obligations is thin. By the time Eleanor and Josephine were in their 30s, the education that had shaped them was 2 decades in the past, and its consequences were fully visible. Eleanor had found a way to use what she had been given, imperfectly, within tight constraints, but genuinely. Josephine had been given similar materials and had found, or been allowed, narrower room to use them. The difference between their subsequent trajectories is not easily explained by talent or disposition alone. It has something to do with the specific accidents of their marriages, with the particular qualities of the men they married, with the degree to which those men's worlds had space in them for a woman's separate development. Edsel Ford, for all the ways his own development was constrained by his father, appears to have had genuine respect for Eleanor's intelligence and taste. He collected alongside her. He treated her aesthetic judgment as something worth consulting. This is not nothing. In a world that had educated both of them toward very particular roles, his willingness to take her seriously within the one domain where seriousness was permitted made a measurable difference to what Eleanor's life contained. Josephine did not have an equivalent arrangement on the record. What she had was her name, her position, and an education that had prepared her to occupy both with minimal friction, which is precisely what an ornamental education was designed to produce. In the spring of 1916, the Detroit Free Press covered Edsel Ford and Eleanor Clay's wedding, with the kind of attention reserved for events that were understood to be, in some sense, civic occasions. The guest list ran to hundreds, the flowers were noted, the dress was described, the families involved were named, and their connections traced so that readers could understand exactly what kind of consolidation was taking place, which Ford money was meeting, which Hudson money, which industrial dynasty was joining with which retail dynasty, and what the resulting unit would represent in the social geography of Michigan's wealthy class. The coverage was not unkind. It was not intended to be. But reading it now, what emerges most clearly is the degree to which the event was being reported as a transaction. A significant, well-executed transaction between parties of compatible standing, rather than as a private moment in two young people's lives. Eleanor was 20 years old. Edsel was 22. They had known each other through the social circuits that existed precisely to engineer these kinds of meetings. The question of what they felt for one another is not one the newspapers addressed, because it was not, in the logic of that coverage, the point. Marriage for women of Eleanor and Josephine's position in this period was not primarily a romantic arrangement. This is not a retroactive judgment. It was understood at the time by the families involved and by the women themselves that marriage was the central economic and social event of a woman's life, the moment when her position was either consolidated or lost, when her future options were either expanded or foreclosed, depending on the quality of the match she made. The education both sisters received had been oriented toward this event. The social calendar they moved through in their late teens and early 20s existed to facilitate it. Everything before the marriage was preparation. Everything after was consequence. Eleanor's match was, by the metrics available to her world, an excellent one. Edsel was the only son of the most prominent industrialist in America. He was not disagreeable. By accounts of those who knew him, he was thoughtful, aesthetically sensitive, and genuinely kind in ways his father was not. He shared her interest in art. The marriage appeared from the outside and perhaps from the inside to offer Eleanor a version of the life she had been prepared for that was better than most versions available to women in her position. What it did not offer, and what the preparation had not equipped her to notice the absence of, was autonomy. Eleanor moved from her family's household into the Ford household. She moved from one set of institutional expectations to another. The freedom she had was real but narrow. She could make decisions about her home's decoration, about her children's early education, about which charities to support, about which art to acquire. These were not trivial freedoms, but they existed within a container whose dimensions she had not chosen and could not significantly alter. Josephine's marriage in 1923 to Walter Bulford II carried a different set of surface appearances. Walter was not in the direct line of the company. He was wealthy, socially established, and his surname was already Ford, which meant the marriage maintained a kind of nominal continuity with the family identity without introducing new industrial complexity. It was, in the social arithmetic of Detroit's upper class, a respectable match. Perhaps not the spectacular consolidation Eleanor's had been, but solid and appropriate. The marriage was quieter in every way. There was no equivalent press coverage to Eleanor's wedding, or if there was, it has not been preserved with the same attention. Josephine and Walter moved into a life that the historical record describes in outline rather than detail. They had children. They had a household. They participated in the social obligations of their class. The marriage did not appear to give Josephine a domain equivalent to Eleanor's art world, a space where her particular interests could be exercised with some degree of public recognition. Walter Bulford II does not emerge from the historical record as a figure of particular complexity or as someone whose world had obvious room in it for a wife's separate development. This is not a condemnation, it is a description. He was a man of his class and time, and the marriage he and Josephine built together appears to have been shaped by the assumptions of that class and time. Assumptions about what a wife did, what she was for, what space she occupied in a household's public and private life. What the marriage market had produced in Josephine's case was a woman whose primary social identity remained attached to her birth name rather than her married one. She was still, in the way Detroit understood her, a Ford daughter. Not a Walter Ford wife, not a public figure in her own right, but a woman whose significance derived from her relationship to her father and brother rather than from anything she had built independently. The marriage had not expanded that identity. It had, if anything, confirmed its limits. Eleanor's marriage carried its own costs that the social surface did not reveal. The consolidation of two wealthy Detroit families had produced a household that was expected to represent something. The Ford family's cultural standing, its philanthropic commitments, its position in the city's institutional life. Eleanor was the person who managed that representation. She organized the dinners. She maintained the relationships with the DIA's board. She made sure the houses functioned at the level of visible perfection that the Ford name required. This was skilled work. It was also invisible work in the sense that its quality was noticed only in its absence. The children came quickly. Henry Ford II was born in 1917, a year after the wedding. Benson followed in 1919. Josephine, named for her aunt, in 1923. William Clay in 1925. 4 children in 9 years. While Eleanor was also managing multiple large households, sustaining her philanthropic commitments, and maintaining the social performance that Edsel's position required. The labor involved in all of this does not appear in the family's public record as labor. It appears, when it appears at all, as lifestyle. There is a letter Eleanor wrote in the late 1920s to a friend, one of the few personal documents that has been quoted in accounts of her life, in which she describes feeling during a period when Edsel was traveling extensively for the company, as though she were running a small institution rather than living in a home. The letter does not frame this as a complaint exactly. It is stated in a tone of wry observation, the tone of a woman who has understood her situation clearly and has decided that clarity, rather than protest, is what is available to her. The institution runs, the children are managed, the dinner parties happen. And somewhere inside all of that, the woman who had once looked at paintings with genuine feeling continues, on certain afternoons, to look at paintings. What neither sister had been given by their education, their upbringing, or their marriages was a model for what it might look like to want something outside those structures, to want it openly, to pursue it with the kind of institutional support and social permission that their male counterparts took entirely for granted. The marriages had delivered what they were designed to deliver. The cost of that delivery was invisible in the transaction, as costs of that kind usually are. In the summer of 1938, Edsel Ford traveled to Europe with Eleanor. It was one of several trips they made together during the years when travel of that kind was still possible. Before the war closed the continent, and before Edsel's health had deteriorated to the point where such journeys became impractical. They visited museums, they looked at paintings, they made acquisitions. The trip produced, among other things, a purchase for their collection that Eleanor would later describe as one of the finest they made together. It was also the year Henry Ford accepted the Grand Cross of the German Eagle. Edsel did not accept an equivalent award. He was not offered one. His father's relationship with the Nazi government was Henry's own, built through the specific channels of Henry's ideology and Henry's decades-long published output on the subject of Jewish influence. But Edsel was the president of the Ford Motor Company, and the company's relationship with the German government during this period was not merely his father's private eccentricity. It involved Ford's German subsidiary, which continued to operate and to profit from arrangements that were, by 1938, impossible to misunderstand. Edsel's precise degree of knowledge about and authority over those arrangements is a question historians have examined without fully resolving. What is legible in the record is that Edsel was a man caught in a structure that consistently denied him the authority his title implied, and that this denial extended to the moments when having genuine authority might have mattered most. He could not override his father on labor policy. He could not override Harry Bennett on security matters. He could not build the kind of management team that might have insulated the company from the worst consequences of Henry's deteriorating judgment. And he could not, apparently, separate the company from its most damaging associations in any decisive way. Eleanor watched this from close range across more than 2 decades of marriage. The specific quality of what she watched is not something she described directly in any document that has been made widely available, but the outline of it is recoverable. She had married a man of genuine quality, thoughtful, capable, aesthetically serious, kind in ways his environment did not reward, and she had watched that man slowly worn down by a father who could not allow his son to exceed him or even to function independently of him. The wearing down was not metaphorical. Edsel Ford's health declined across the late 1930s and early 1940s in ways that his doctors attributed to stomach cancer, but that people close to him attributed in addition to the sustained stress of his position. He had undulant fever, contracted from unpasteurized milk. Henry Ford had strong opinions about pasteurization, which he opposed, and the family's dairy at Fair Lane produced the milk the family consumed. The undulant fever weakened him in ways that made the cancer's progress more rapid. Henry Ford's dietary ideology had contributed in this specific and material way to his son's physical deterioration. Eleanor knew this. She had been told what the doctors believed. She continued to live inside the family structure that had produced it. There was no clean exit available to her, no position from which she could have removed Edsel from his father's orbit without destroying the marriage, the family's institutional standing, and the financial arrangements that supported everything she and her children depended on. The trap was total. It was also invisible from outside, because from outside it looked like wealth. In 1940, Edsel and Eleanor completed the construction of their house on Gockler Point, a property on Lake St. Clair that Eleanor had been significantly involved in designing. The house was large, formally organized, and reflected Eleanor's aesthetic sensibility more directly than any previous Ford family property. She had worked with the architect on its details. She had made decisions about its spaces. It was, in the most tangible way available to her, something she had shaped. Edsel was already ill when they moved in. He lived in the house for approximately 3 years before his death. The house that Eleanor had built as an expression of her own taste and judgment became almost immediately the place where she watched her husband die. The children were present during these years in the complicated way that adult children are present. Close enough to observe, distant enough to be managing their own emerging lives. Henry Ford II was in his early 20s and had joined the Navy. Benson was slightly younger, also in military service. The daughters, Josephine and Anne, were in the social circuits appropriate to their ages and positions. The household was full of the ordinary activity of a large, wealthy family, and underneath that activity, Edsel was getting worse. Eleanor's response to Edsel's illness, as described in accounts of the period, was practical and controlled. She managed the household. She maintained the family's social engagements to the degree that was possible. She was present. She did not apparently fall apart in ways that were visible to others, which is either a description of remarkable self-possession or a description of what it looks like when a woman has been trained since childhood to keep her interior experience from reaching her exterior surface. Possibly both. Edsel died on May 26, 1943. He was 49 years old. The obituaries were extensive and respectful. They noted his contributions to the company's design sensibility, his art patronage, his philanthropy. Several of them noted with some delicacy the difficulty of his position within the company during his father's long dominance. None of them addressed what that difficulty had cost him. Eleanor was 50 years old. She had been Edsel's wife for 27 years. She had 4 children between the ages of 17 and 26. She had multiple large properties to manage, a philanthropic portfolio, a collection of art that she and Edsel had built together, and that now existed in a house that was suddenly completely hers to occupy alone. And she had a father-in-law who was still alive, still nominally in control of the company, and whose relationship with her had never been warm. The weeks immediately following Edsel's death produced a situation that illuminates, with unusual clarity, the actual structure of power Eleanor had been living inside. Henry Ford, deteriorated as he was reinstated as company president. Harry Bennett began maneuvering to consolidate his position as Henry's heir apparent inside the company, a prospect that, had it been realized, would have placed a man with no Ford blood and deep connections to organized crime at the head of one of the world's largest industrial enterprises. Eleanor moved to prevent it. She worked through Clara Ford, her mother-in-law, who had her own reasons for wanting Bennett's influence curtailed. She worked through the family's legal and institutional channels. She pushed for Henry II's release from the Navy and his installation at the company with enough authority to actually function. The effort took 2 years. It succeeded in September of 1945, when Henry II became president, and one of his first significant acts was to fire Harry Bennett. The success was real. It was also the kind of success that required Eleanor to work entirely through other people, through her mother-in-law, through her son, through institutional processes she could influence but not control directly. She could not simply walk into the company and make decisions. She had no formal role there. What she had was proximity, persistence, and a clear understanding of what was at stake. The house on Gawker Point held all of this. It held the art she and Edsel had chosen together. It held the rooms she had designed. It held the specific quality of silence that large, well-maintained houses acquire when the person they were built around is gone. The house Eleanor Ford built on Gawker Point was completed in 1940 and sat on a stretch of Lake St. Clair shoreline in Grosse Pointe Shores, a community whose primary social function was the maintenance of distance. From Detroit's industrial neighborhoods, from its immigrant populations, from the labor force that built the cars the Ford family sold, the house had approximately 16,000 square feet. It had a pool. It had carefully maintained grounds. It had a boathouse. It was, by the standards of its moment, a restrained expression of wealth, not ostentatious in the manner of the Gilded Age estates that preceded it, but quietly, thoroughly, expensive in every detail. Albert Kahn designed it. Kahn was Detroit's most significant industrial architect, the man who had designed the River Rouge plant, among others. And the choice was deliberate. Eleanor wanted a house that was serious rather than decorative, that reflected considered taste rather than the performance of taste. The result was a Georgian revival structure that organized itself around its art. The rooms were scaled and lit to accommodate paintings. The walls were built to hold them. The house was, in a functional sense, a frame for a collection that Eleanor and Edsel had been building for 2 decades, and that would continue to grow after Edsel's death. Directed entirely by Eleanor's judgment, to live inside a house designed around art is to live inside a specific set of intentions about how a space should feel and what it should communicate. Eleanor's intentions were aesthetic and serious. The house was meant to be beautiful in a way that reflected genuine knowledge rather than mere expenditure. It largely succeeded. Visitors who came to Gawker Point in later decades consistently described the experience of moving through its rooms as something distinct from the experience of moving through other wealthy people's houses. There was a coherence to it, a sense that the objects had been chosen by someone who understood them, rather than simply acquired by someone who could afford them. But the house also watched. This is not a poetic description. It is a practical one. A house of that size and standing, in a community like Grosse Pointe Shores in the 1940s and 1950s, existed inside a dense network of social surveillance. Who visited and how often was noted. What events were held and who attended was observed. Whether the widow of a prominent industrialist was managing her household correctly, maintaining the appropriate level of social activity, neither retreating entirely nor appearing improperly celebratory, was a matter of ongoing communal assessment. Eleanor's behavior in the years after Edsel's death was watched with the particular attention that wealthy widows attract, which combines genuine concern with something closer to audit. She did not retreat. This is the first thing the record establishes about Eleanor after 1943. She maintained her philanthropic commitments. She continued her involvement with the Detroit Institute of Arts. She traveled. She continued to acquire art. She was present at the social occasions her position required. This comportment was correct, and it was noted as correct. It was also possibly a form of discipline, a commitment to the external forms of functioning that prevented the internal experience from becoming visible or from becoming, in some harder-to-manage sense, primary. The art in the house was not incidental to this. The collection that covered the walls of Gockler Point was the most legible evidence available of Eleanor's interior life, more legible perhaps than anything she said or wrote in the decade after Edsel's death. She had chosen these objects. She had exercised judgment in their selection that was genuinely her own. They represented something she had built, with Edsel but also independently of him, that continued after him. To move through the rooms of that house in the years after 1943 was to move through something that was entirely hers, in a way that very little else in her life had been. And yet the house was also, inescapably, a monument to a marriage. The rooms had been designed for two people. The scale of the place assumed a household with a man at its center, the dinners for large numbers of guests, the entertaining that a prominent industrialist family was expected to sustain, the social calendar that the house's size implied. Eleanor maintained those functions after Edsel's death, but maintaining them required her to inhabit a space that had been built around a life she no longer had. The house was perfectly preserved. What it had been built to contain was gone. Grosse Pointe Shores was itself a structure that required maintenance. The community had restrictive covenants, formal and informal mechanisms designed to keep its population homogeneous in ways that were understood by everyone who lived there and not discussed in polite company. Detroit's Jewish community, regardless of wealth or professional standing, was not welcome in Grosse Pointe in the years Eleanor lived there. The point system that Grosse Pointe's Property Owners Association used to screen potential residents, assigning numerical values to applicants based on factors including perceived ethnic and religious background, was not publicly exposed until 1945, when it appeared in a newspaper investigation, but it had been operating for years before that. Eleanor Ford lived in Grosse Pointe throughout the period when this system was in operation. She was a neighbor and a community member of people who administered it. Her father-in-law had spent decades publishing material that made the intellectual case for exactly the kind of exclusion the point system practiced. The relationship between the Ford family's ideology and the community in which Eleanor made her home is not a distant or abstract connection. It is a proximate one. Whether Eleanor was aware of the specific mechanism of the point system before its public exposure is not something the record resolves. Whether she found it troubling after its exposure is likewise not documented in any statement she made publicly. What the record shows is that she continued to live in Grosse Pointe, continued to maintain her house there, and continued to participate in the community's institutional life without apparent disruption. The Detroit Institute of Arts, which Eleanor supported with increasing commitment through the 1940s and 1950s, sat in a different part of the city. In what was then, and would become increasingly, a Detroit neighborhood undergoing the demographic transformations that the policies of communities like Grosse Pointe were designed to accelerate. The museum was a public institution, accessible in principle to everyone. Eleanor's commitment to it was genuine and consequential. But the distance between the museum's address and Eleanor's address was also the distance between the Detroit that the Ford family's labor force lived in and the Detroit that the Ford family lived in. Josephine's domestic geography in these years is less precisely documented. She lived in the Grosse Pointe area as well, in a household that the record describes in less detail than Eleanor's. Her house did not generate the same kind of sustained attention. It was not a monument in the way Gockler Point was not organized around a collection of significance, was not visited by curators and art historians seeking access to its holdings. It was a wealthy woman's house in an exclusive suburb, and it watched her in the same way those houses always do, and she maintained the same kind of external composure those houses always required. And the interior experience of living inside it is something the record does not illuminate. What both houses shared was the specific quality of enclosure that wealth at that level produces. The grounds were maintained, the staff was managed, the social calendar was organized. Everything was in order, the order was total, and it was visible and it cost something to maintain that the houses themselves, in their polished, well-lit rooms, gave no indication of. In 1946, Eleanor Ford gave the Detroit Institute of Arts a collection of paintings that represented by any measure one of the most significant single donations the museum had ever received. The gift included works that she and Edsel had acquired over 2 decades. Dutch and Flemish masters, French impressionists, American paintings, objects whose combined value was substantial enough that the donation changed, in a lasting way, the character of what the DIA held and what it could offer to the people who walked through its doors. The gift was documented, celebrated, and attached to the Ford name in the institutional memory of the museum in ways that persist to the present day. It was also made in a city where Ford Motor Company workers had been fighting for basic labor protections for more than a decade, where the violence used against union organizers in the 1930s had left specific, documented casualties, and where the families of those workers lived in neighborhoods whose material conditions bore no relationship to the neighborhoods the Ford family occupied. This is not a coincidence that requires elaborate construction to perceive. It is simply what was happening simultaneously in the same city. Eleanor's gift to the DIA and the conditions of Ford's labor force existed in the same geography, in the same years, funded ultimately by the same source. The Detroit Institute of Arts had been a significant institution in the city since the late 19th century, and by the time Eleanor became one of its most important patrons, it had already accumulated a complicated relationship with the industrial wealth that sustained it. The murals Diego Rivera had painted in the museum's central courtyard in 1932 and 1933. Detroit Industry, a commission that Rivera executed with the support of Edsel Ford, who had admired Rivera's work and arranged the commission, depicted Ford workers at the River Rouge plant. The men in the murals were not abstractions. They were recognizable portraits of specific workers, painted by a committed Marxist at the invitation of the son of one of America's most aggressively anti-union industrialists. Edsel had understood something about this irony, or at least had been willing to inhabit it. He had defended Rivera's murals when Detroit civic leaders demanded their removal following public controversy over their content. He had stood by the commission. This was, by the standards of his position and his family, an unusual act of independent judgment. Eleanor had supported his position, but supporting Rivera's murals and addressing the conditions of Rivera's subjects were different things. The murals remained on the walls of the DIA. The labor conditions at River Rouge remained what they were. Art and philanthropy operated in a register that was adjacent to the industrial relationships that funded them, without being required to address those relationships directly. Eleanor's philanthropic commitments expanded significantly after Edsel's death. She gave to the DIA with increasing regularity and on an increasing scale. She supported hospitals, educational institutions, and other cultural organizations across Detroit. The Eleanor Ford House, as Gockler Point would eventually come to be known after she donated it to a foundation, would become, after her death, a public institution in its own right. By the end of her life, the amount she had directed toward public and cultural institutions in Detroit was very large. Philanthropy of this kind operates by a logic that is not difficult to describe, but is rarely described in the presence of the philanthropist. It takes wealth generated through specific industrial and labor relationships, removes it from the private domain, and redirects it toward public goods in ways that attach the donor's name to the public good rather than to the generating relationships. The museum bears the donor's name. The hospital wing bears the donor's name. The labor practices that produce the donation do not bear anyone's name in the same building. This is not unique to Eleanor Ford. It is the standard operating logic of American industrial philanthropy throughout the period in question, and it was practiced with equal consistency by the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Mellons, and every other family whose wealth derived from the same kinds of industrial arrangements. Eleanor was not exceptional in this regard. She was entirely typical. What the typicality makes difficult is the question of what she understood about the relationship between her giving and its source. The DIA gifts came from the same accumulation that had employed Harry Bennett. The hospital donations came from the same accumulation that had allowed unpasteurized milk to be served to Edsel Ford. The cultural institutions that bore the Ford name were funded by decades of labor practices that the Ford family's own internal records document in considerable detail. Eleanor had not built those practices. She had not designed them. She had not, as far as the record shows, advocated for them. But she had lived inside their results for 30 years before she began directing their proceeds toward public institutions. The giving was real. Its relationship to what it came from was also real. Both things were true simultaneously, in the same city, in the same decades. Josephine's philanthropic record is considerably thinner than Eleanor's. She gave. Her name appears on committee lists and donor rosters in the Detroit area across the mid-20th century. But she did not develop the kind of sustained, significant relationship with a single institution that Eleanor built with the DIA. And she did not make the kinds of headline gifts that attached her name to specific collections or buildings in lasting ways. Her philanthropy was real, and it was modest, and it did not produce the institutional legacy that Eleanor's did. This difference in scale and visibility is partly a function of the difference in wealth between the two women. Eleanor, as Edsel's widow, had access to resources that Josephine, as the daughter rather than the wife of the company's central figure, did not have in equivalent measure, but it is also a function of the difference in the structures available to them. Eleanor had the DIA relationship, which had been built with Edsel but which she could sustain and expand after his death because the relationship was rooted in her own knowledge and judgment, rather than merely in his institutional position. Josephine did not appear to have an equivalent structure, a domain where her specific capacities had been exercised long enough to create something she could continue independently. The Ford Foundation, established in 1936, was a separate entity from Eleanor's personal philanthropy, though the family name connected them in the public imagination. The foundation grew after Henry Ford's death in 1947 and the subsequent Ford family decisions about its direction into one of the largest philanthropic organizations in the world. Its resources dwarfed anything Eleanor gave personally. Its relationship to the labor and industrial history of the Ford Motor Company was exactly the same logical structure on a vastly larger scale. Henry II's management of both the company and the family's philanthropic legacy in the years after 1945 produced its own set of complications and contradictions that ran alongside Eleanor's personal giving without being identical to it. The family's institutional philanthropic identity and Eleanor's personal philanthropic identity occupied the same name, the same city, and the same historical period, and their relationship to each other was one that neither the family nor the institutions involved had much interest in examining closely. The DIA holdings that Eleanor's gifts helped build are now genuinely significant, objects of real quality that the museum's visitors encounter without any necessary awareness of the labor history embedded in their provenance. The paintings are good. The donation was consequential. The question of what the donation was also doing, alongside being a genuine cultural gift, is one that the museum's institutional narrative has never found a comfortable way to address and probably never will. Henry Ford died on April 7, 1947. He was 83 years old, and he died at Fair Lane during a spring flood that had knocked out the estate's power plant, the same plant he had insisted on building when the house was constructed in 1915, the same plant whose operation he had overseen with the same controlling attention he brought to everything else at Fair Lane. The lights were out when he died. The family used candles. There is something in that detail that the historical record preserves without comment and which does not require comment. Clara Ford survived him by 3 years, dying in 1950. With her death, the last of the generation that had built the Ford world from its origins passed out of it, and Eleanor and Josephine were left inside a structure that had been shaped entirely by people who were now gone, a structure whose physical forms, institutional relationships, and social obligations continued to organize their lives without the figures who had originally imposed those organizations being present to maintain them. The 4 years between Edsel's death in 1943 and Henry's in 1947 had been for Eleanor a period of sustained navigation. She had worked to install Henry II at the company. She had managed her household. She had maintained her philanthropic commitments. She had done all of this while her father-in-law was still alive and still, in his deteriorated way, a force that required accounting for. His death removed that specific pressure. It did not remove the consequences of everything that pressure had produced. Henry II's ascension to the company presidency in 1945 had been Eleanor's primary objective in the years immediately after Edsel's death, and it had succeeded. But the success produced its own complications. Henry II was 28 years old when he took over the company. He was intelligent, aggressive, and determined to prove that he could run the Ford Motor Company in ways his father had not been permitted to. He brought in outside managers, the group of young executives who came to be known as the Whiz Kids, and began reorganizing an institution that had been allowed to deteriorate significantly during the Bennett years. He was also, in ways that would become clearer over time, his grandfather's grandson in certain temperamental respects. He was capable of the same kind of domineering behavior, the same impatience with opposition, the same willingness to use institutional power to settle personal scores. He would be married 3 times. He would fire Lee Iacocca in a meeting that Iacocca later described in terms that recalled, with uncomfortable precision, the dynamic between Henry Sr. and Edsel. He would manage the company with a combination of genuine ability and personal volatility that produced results both impressive and damaging. Eleanor's relationship with Henry II after he took over the company is one that the historical record presents in muted tones. She was his mother. She had worked to put him in the position he now occupied. She had a legitimate claim on his gratitude and attention. But Henry II was not a man who organized his behavior around gratitude, and his mother's role in his life, once he had secured the position she had helped him obtain, appears to have become a less central concern. This is a pattern that appears with enough frequency in the histories of powerful families that it has something like a predictable shape. The mother works to advance the son. The son advances. The son's world, once established, has less space in it for the mother than the mother's efforts on his behalf might have seemed to warrant. Eleanor had 4 children, and her relationships with all 4 of them in the years after Edsel's death were shaped, in different ways, by the same basic dynamic. She was the person who had maintained the household, managed the family's institutional relationships, and kept the structure functioning, and her children were people who had grown up inside that structure without being required to see the maintenance as labor. Josephine, Eleanor's daughter, named for her aunt Heiress, married in 1943, the same year her father died. The timing placed a wedding inside the same calendar year as a funeral, which required a specific kind of social navigation. The daughter's life was beginning at the moment the father's ended. Eleanor managed both occasions. She was 50 years old, and she managed them. The deaths that accumulated around Eleanor in the 1940s were not only Edsel's and Henry's. Her own health began to show strain in the years after Edsel died, in ways the record documents without extensive detail. She had episodes of illness that required periods of reduced activity. She continued her philanthropic work. She continued to travel. She continued to acquire art. The external functioning remained intact. What the illness represented in terms of the body's response to a decade of sustained pressure is something the medical records do not address in terms that the historical sources preserve. For Josephine Ford, Edsel's sister, Eleanor's sister-in-law, the deaths of the 1940s had a different valence. She had lost her brother in 1943 and her father in 1947. And with those deaths, the 2 figures who had most defined her public identity, the family relationships through which she was primarily known, were gone. She was not the widow of a prominent man. She was not the mother of the company's new president. She was the surviving daughter of Henry Ford, a role whose significance was historical rather than active, retrospective rather than ongoing. The Ford Foundation's expansion in the years after Henry's death was, in institutional terms, one of the most significant philanthropic developments of the mid-20th century. The foundation received a very large portion of the Ford family's non-voting shares as a result of the estate arrangements made after Henry's death, and its assets grew accordingly to a scale that made it, by the early 1950s, one of the wealthiest foundations in the world. The decisions about what to do with those resources were made by a board and by professional staff. The family's women were not the decision makers. Eleanor's personal philanthropic work continued alongside the foundation's expansion, separate from it in institutional terms but connected to it in the public imagination through the shared name. She gave to the DIA. she gave to hospitals. She made decisions about her collection. These were real exercises of real agency within a specific and bounded domain. Outside that domain, the largest concentrations of Ford-derived wealth were being managed by men she had not chosen, and in directions she did not control. The house on Gawker Point held its art. The rooms were maintained. The social calendar continued. And in the institutional landscape of Detroit and Michigan and American philanthropy, the Ford name was doing things that Eleanor could observe but not direct, attached to decisions made by people whose authority derived from the same source as hers, but who had been given formal institutional roles that she had not. What the deaths of the 1940s had produced, taken together, was a woman of considerable private wealth and genuine cultural influence, operating in a world that had been restructured by those deaths in ways that consistently moved formal authority away from her and toward men. Her son, the foundation's officers, the company's new management team, whose positions had been made possible in various ways by her own sustained and largely unacknowledged effort. The house continued to watch. The art on its walls did not change. Outside its windows, Detroit was beginning its own long, slow transformation into something that the Ford family's decisions had helped to make, and that none of its members would be required to live inside. There is a photograph of Josephine Ford taken sometime in the early 1950s. She is seated in a room that suggests wealth without specifying it. Good furniture, careful light, the kind of background that communicates position without revealing character. She is dressed correctly. Her expression is composed in the way that women of her class and generation had been composing their expressions for formal photographs since childhood. She looks like what she was, a wealthy woman in her early 50s, a Ford by birth, a figure of established social position in the Detroit area. The photograph communicates nothing that she had not intended to communicate, which is precisely the problem with using it as evidence of anything. Josephine Ford's life resists the kind of documentation that Eleanor's life, with its art collection and its DIA relationship and its sustained philanthropic record, makes possible. Eleanor left institutional traces. She made gifts that were recorded. She had relationships with curators and board members who later described those relationships in oral histories and institutional memoirs. She acquired objects that were cataloged. Even her silences are surrounded by enough documented activity that the silences themselves become legible. You can see what she was not saying because you can see what she was doing instead. Josephine left fewer traces of that kind. Her name appears in social registers, in committee lists, in the kind of Detroit area press coverage that documented the movements of prominent families across the mid-20th century. She attended events. She was present at the occasions her position required her to attend. She gave to charitable organizations. But the documentary record of her interior life, her preferences, her judgments, her private experience of the decades she lived through, is thin in ways that Eleanor's is not. This thinness is itself a form of evidence, though of an indirect kind. Women who leave few institutional traces are often women whose energies were not directed toward institutions, women whose lives were organized primarily around domestic and social obligations that did not generate the kind of record that persists in archives. Josephine's life appears to have been organized in this way. She managed a household. She raised children. She participated in the social world of wealthy Detroit. She did not build the kind of sustained relationship with a public institution that would have created a documentary record of her engagement with the world outside her domestic sphere. Walter Bulford II, her husband, was a man whose public profile was modest by the standards of the family name he carried. He was not a figure of major industrial or civic significance. His Ford surname was inherited from a branch of the family that had not been at the center of the company's history, and his professional life did not produce the kind of public record that attaches to men who run large institutions or make significant public decisions. The marriage was, in the Detroit social world, entirely respectable and entirely unremarkable. It did not make Josephine more visible. It made her less. In the years after her brother Edsel's death in 1943, Josephine's position in the Ford family narrative became increasingly peripheral. The narrative had a new center: Henry II, Eleanor, the company's reconstruction under new management, the foundation's expansion. These were the Ford stories that the press covered and that the institutional histories recorded. Josephine was adjacent to all of them and central to none. She was present at family occasions. She was a Ford. But the story of what the Ford name meant in the post-war decades was being written around her rather than through her. Her children, she and Walter had several, grew up inside this peripheral position. They were Fords by name, but at a remove from the family's industrial and institutional center that made the name both significant and somewhat burdensome. It carried expectations and associations without carrying the access to resources and decision-making that the expectations implied. To be Josephine's child was to be a Ford in the way that a cousin is a cousin, related to something important, but not inside it. Josephine's health declined across the 1950s in ways the record documents without detail. She had illnesses. She had periods of reduced activity. The specifics are not available in the sources that have been made public. What the record shows is that her public presence, already limited, became more limited still as the decade progressed. She appeared less frequently in the social notices that had previously marked her attendance at Detroit area events. She withdrew gradually from the circuits that had defined her visible social existence. Withdrawal of this kind, in a woman of Josephine's age and position in the 1950s, did not generate comment or concern in the way that equivalent withdrawal might generate comment now. Women of her class and generation were expected to organize their lives around domestic obligations. And when those obligations contracted, when children grew and left, when the social calendar of early middle age gave way to the quieter existence of later middle age, the contraction was understood as natural rather than as loss. Nobody asked what Josephine Ford was doing with her time, because the question itself would have seemed inappropriate. Women of her position did not need to be doing something specific with their time. They needed to be maintaining their households and their positions. If they were doing that less visibly, it was their own affair. The silences in Josephine's record accumulate across the 1950s in a way that suggests not simply the absence of documentation, but the gradual narrowing of the life itself. The social world she had inhabited since childhood was changing around her. Detroit's demographic transformations were accelerating. The established families of Grosse Pointe were navigating the anxieties those transformations produced. The institutional landscape of the city was being reshaped by forces that the philanthropic and social activities of women like Josephine had never been designed to address. She had been equipped by her education and her upbringing and her marriage to function in a specific social world. That world was contracting, and she contracted with it. There is a quality to lives lived at the periphery of large events that is difficult to render without making it seem more dramatic than it actually is. Josephine's life was not a tragedy in the theatrical sense. She was not destroyed by a single catastrophic event or a decisive act of betrayal. She was worn down, gradually and without spectacle, by the accumulation of a life organized around other people's significance. Her father had been significant. Her brother had been significant. Her family name was significant. She herself had been, in the social world that assigned significance, a Ford daughter and a Ford wife and a Ford mother, a series of relational identities that placed her in proximity to importance without locating the importance in her. By the time Josephine died in 1964, at the age of 64, she had outlived her brother by 21 years and her father by 17. She had lived through the full arc of what the Ford name had meant in the 20th century up to that point. Its construction, its dominance, its complications, its partial rehabilitation under Henry II. She had been present for all of it, and the record of what her presence had felt like from the inside, of what she had thought about the decades she had moved through, of what it had cost her to be who she was in the family she had been born into, is not something the archive preserves. Her death was noted in the Detroit press in the way that the deaths of prominent family members are noted, with respect, with enumeration of survivors, with acknowledgement of the name she carried. The notice was not long. It did not attempt to characterize what her life had contained. It gave the facts that were available and left the rest, as the rest had always been left, unexamined. Eleanor was 67 when Josephine died. She had 20 years left. The house on Gockler Point was still full of art. The DIA relationship continued, The philanthropic work continued. The external functioning remained, as it had remained through Edsel's death and Henry's death and Clara's death, intact. What Josephine's death added to Eleanor's experience of her own life is not something Eleanor recorded in any document the public record preserves. The two women had moved through the same family world for decades, had shared the Ford name and its complications, had navigated its social obligations, had watched the same central figures deteriorate and die, had maintained the same quality of composed external surface over whatever their interior experience contained. And now one of them was gone, and the composed surface continued because it was the only response that had ever been made available. In September of 1945, Henry Ford II walked into the Ford Motor Company and began dismantling the apparatus Harry Bennett had built over 2 decades of his grandfather's declining years. He fired Bennett directly and personally, a meeting that Bennett later described as brief and without ceremony, and then began the systematic removal of Bennett's network from the company's management structure. It was, by most accounts, a decisive and necessary act. It was also the first major public demonstration of the temperament Henry II would bring to running one of the world's largest companies for the next 3 decades. Eleanor had worked to put him there. She had navigated the family's institutional channels, managed the relationship with Clara Ford, and maintained sustained pressure toward the outcome of her son's installation as company president during a period when she was also managing her household, her philanthropic commitments, and the first years of her widowhood. The effort had been real, and it had succeeded. What she had produced was a man who would run the Ford Motor Company with genuine ability and with a personal style that reproduced in specific and documented ways some of the worst characteristics of the environment in which he had been raised. Henry II was not Harry Bennett. He was not Henry Sr. He was a more sophisticated figure than either, educated at Yale, capable of the kind of institutional thinking that had been entirely foreign to his grandfather. But he was also, by the accounts of people who worked closely with him across his tenure, capable of sudden personal cruelty, of decisions made on the basis of loyalty and resentment rather than on the merits of the situation, of the kind of domineering behavior that used institutional power to settle scores that were essentially private. The firing of Lee Iacocca in 1978, after years of a relationship that had deteriorated into personal animosity, was conducted in a way that Iacocca described publicly as both arbitrary and humiliating. Iacocca's account of what Henry II said to him, that sometimes you just don't like somebody, circulated widely and became part of the Ford institutional mythology. Eleanor watched her son run the company for 30 years. What she thought about the specific ways he exercised his authority is not something she expressed in any public statement. She attended the occasions his position required her to attend. She maintained the family relationships that were available to maintain. She was his mother, and she continued to be his mother in the way that wealthy family matriarchs continue in that role, present at significant events, available as a point of continuity, not involved in the management decisions that were, in any case, not hers to be involved in. Benson Ford, Eleanor's second son, joined the company after the war and occupied a series of positions that were always adjacent to genuine authority rather than inside it. He was a Ford by blood, which guaranteed him a presence in the company's public identity, but he did not develop the institutional authority that Henry II consolidated around himself with considerable thoroughness. Benson's life inside the Ford world was that of a man who had inherited the name and the expectation, but not the position, a condition that, as the record suggests, produced its own specific kind of frustration and dissolution. He died in 1978, the same year Iacocca was fired, at the age of 58. The accounts of his later years suggest a man who had not found a satisfying way to occupy the space his family name had assigned him. William Clay Ford, the youngest of Eleanor's sons, took a different path, one that moved away from the automotive company and toward the Detroit Lions, the NFL franchise he eventually owned and operated for decades. His relationship with the Lions was genuine and sustained, and it gave him a domain in which his authority was real and his decisions consequential in ways that the shadow of his brother's dominance at the company made difficult to achieve elsewhere. He was also, by the accounts available, the child whose relationship with Eleanor remained the warmest and most consistent across the later decades of her life. Eleanor's daughter Josephine, named for her aunt, born in 1923, married in the year of her father's death and built a life at some remove from the institutional Ford world. Her marriage and subsequent life do not appear extensively in the Ford family's institutional record, which reflects both the social invisibility of married women in her generation and the degree to which the family narrative had organized itself around the sons rather than the daughters. She was a Ford in the way that daughters of prominent families are Fords, carrying the name until marriage transferred them into a different nominal identity, and then existing in the family's story primarily as a peripheral presence at significant occasions. Anne Ford, Eleanor's youngest child, born in 1925, had a life that intersected with the Ford institutional world in ways that generated some public record. She was socially prominent in the circles that wealthy Detroit families moved in, and her name appeared in the kind of press coverage that tracked the marriages and social activities of prominent family members. Her relationship with her mother in the later decades of Eleanor's life is described in available sources as close, and she was among the people present in Eleanor's life as Eleanor aged. What Eleanor had transmitted to her children, through the household she managed, the values she modeled, the specific quality of the environment she maintained at Gockler Point, and at the family's other properties, is a question that the record addresses obliquely rather than directly. The art was present in the house. The commitment to cultural institutions was visible in Eleanor's sustained philanthropic activity. The quality of the domestic environment she had built reflected genuine aesthetic judgment. These were real things that her children grew up surrounded by. But the children had also grown up in a household organized around a father who was being systematically diminished by his own father. In an environment where the exercise of independent judgment by the senior male figure was consistently overridden, in a family whose public identity was built on industrial practices that the household's daily life was designed to remain at a comfortable remove from. What children absorb from these conditions is not something that presents itself cleanly in subsequent behavior. It distributes itself across temperament and decision and the specific quality of the relationships they build with the people around them. Henry II's marriages, 3 of them, each dissolving in circumstances the press covered with varying degrees of detail, suggest a man for whom sustained intimate relationship was difficult. His first marriage to Anne MacDonald lasted from 1940 to 1964, through the years of his rise to power and his consolidation of control at the company. His second marriage to Maria Christina Austin lasted from 1965 to 1980. His third marriage to Kathleen DeRoss continued until his death in 1987. The pattern across these marriages, the repetition, the duration, the circumstances of the transitions, is not reducible to a simple explanation, but it is a pattern, and it ran alongside his professional life in ways that the people who worked with him were aware of even when they did not address it directly. Eleanor's own model of marriage, sustained, contained, organized around the management of a large household and the maintenance of social and philanthropic obligations, was not one her children reproduced with any consistency. The marriage she had maintained with Edsel had been shaped by conditions that were specific to their generation and their position, and those conditions did not transfer to the next generation in any straightforward way. What did transfer with something like consistency was the isolation, the quality of being enclosed within a world defined by the Ford name and its obligations and expectations without obvious mechanisms for stepping outside it or for evaluating it from a position that was not already inside it. Henry II ran the company with the unquestioned authority of someone who had never had occasion to seriously imagine a different kind of life. His siblings occupied the space the family assigned them with varying degrees of comfort. Eleanor's children were, in their different ways, people who had been shaped by the world she had maintained without being given adequate tools for understanding what that maintenance had cost, or what it had required her to set aside, or what the world outside it contained. The house on Gockler Point held the art, the dinners continued, the occasions were attended, and the children grew into adults who carried the Ford name across the second half of the 20th century in ways that bore the marks of everything that name had accumulated. Its wealth, its public history, its complications, its capacity for both genuine achievement and systematic blindness. Without any of them being equipped by the world Eleanor had worked so hard to maintain, to account for all of it clearly. In the summer of 1967, Detroit burned. The uprising that began on July 23rd and continued for 5 days left 43 people dead, over 1,000 injured, and approximately 2,000 buildings destroyed. It was one of the most destructive civil disturbances in American urban history. The National Guard was deployed. Federal troops followed. The images that circulated in the national press, smoke rising over the city's residential neighborhoods, National Guardsmen moving through streets lined with burned buildings, families standing in front of homes that were no longer habitable, became, for much of the country, the defining image of Detroit. Eleanor Ford was 70 years old that summer. She was living in the house on Gockler Point, 11 miles from the center of the uprising, in a community that was, by design and by decades of deliberate social engineering, as distant from Detroit's working-class residential neighborhoods as geography and wealth could arrange. The distance was not accidental. It had been built over the preceding decades through exactly the mechanism: restrictive covenants, discriminatory lending practices, exclusionary community associations that had concentrated Detroit's black population in specific neighborhoods while concentrating its wealthy white population in communities like Grosse Pointe Shores. The Ford Motor Company's relationship to the conditions that produced the 1967 uprising was not incidental. The company had employed black workers since the early decades of its existence. Henry Ford had, in this specific respect, been less overtly discriminatory in his hiring practices than many of his contemporaries, though his motivations were complex and his treatment of black workers once hired reproduced the paternalism and control that characterized his management of all labor. The River Rouge plant had a significant black workforce for decades before the 1967 uprising. Those workers lived in Detroit's residential neighborhoods. They did not live in Grosse Pointe Shores. The relationship between where Ford workers lived and where the Ford family lived was, by 1967, more than 4 decades old as a geographical fact. The highway systems built through Detroit's neighborhoods in the 1950s, projects that had demolished established black communities to build infrastructure that primarily served suburban commuters, had accelerated the concentration of poverty in the city's core, while the wealth generated by the automotive industry continued to accumulate in communities that those same workers were systematically prevented from entering. Eleanor had been philanthropically active in Detroit's cultural institutions throughout this period. The DIA sat on Woodward Avenue in the city's cultural district, at a remove from the neighborhoods most directly affected by the policies that were reshaping Detroit's geography. Her giving to the museum continued through the 1960s. The gifts were real and their cultural consequences were real. They did not address the conditions that were visible from the museum's windows. Henry II's response to the 1967 uprising was more active than Eleanor's, in the sense that he was a man with institutional power who could make organizational decisions in response to what had happened. He was involved in the New Detroit Committee, a coalition of business, civic, and community leaders formed in the uprising's aftermath to address Detroit's underlying conditions. He committed Ford Motor Company resources to job training and hiring programs. These were genuine efforts, by the standards of what major corporations were willing to do in 1967 and in the years that followed. They were also efforts made by a man who lived in Grosse Pointe, whose company had been producing automobiles in suburban plants rather than in the city proper, and whose family's residential choices had been consistent with the patterns of white flight that the New Detroit Committee was ostensibly trying to address. The institutional response to the crisis and the personal geography of the responders occupied the same uncomfortable relationship that Eleanor's art philanthropy had always occupied with the labor history that funded it. The Detroit that existed in 1967 had been built, in significant part, by decisions made over preceding decades by exactly the kind of people Eleanor and Henry II were. Decisions about where to locate plants, where to build highways, which communities to invest in and which to allow to contract, which workers to house where. The Ford family had not made all of those decisions, but they had made many of them, and they had acquiesced to others. and they had lived inside the results in communities that insulated them from the most visible consequences. Eleanor's philanthropic response to the 1967 uprising, if she made one in any specific or documented form, is not something the historical record I have access to details clearly. She was 70 years old. She was not a public figure in the way Henry II was. She did not have the institutional platform that would have made a response visible in the way his response was visible. What she had was the house on Gawkler Point and the DIA relationship and the collection of art that covered the house's walls, and the city in which all of those things were located was, that summer, on fire. The Detroit Institute of Arts itself was not damaged in the uprising. It sat in an area that the fires did not reach. Its collections, including the works Eleanor had donated over the previous 2 decades, were intact. The Rivera murals depicting Ford workers at the River Rouge plant remained on the walls of the museum's central courtyard, as they had remained since 1933, available for contemplation by anyone who came through the museum's doors. Josephine Ford had died 3 years before the uprising in 1964. She had not lived to see the city she had grown up near transformed in this specific and violent way. Whether this is a mercy or an omission, the record does not adjudicate. The Ford name in 1967 meant, simultaneously, several things that could not be made to cohere. It meant the company that employed a significant portion of the Detroit metropolitan area's workforce, including the black workers whose neighborhoods were burning. It meant the philanthropic foundation that was one of the largest in the world and was funding social programs across the country, including programs ostensibly aimed at addressing the conditions that produced uprisings like the one in Detroit. It meant the art collection in the house in Grosse Pointe Shores. It meant the Rivera murals in the DIA. It meant the Dearborn Independent and the Grand Cross of the German Eagle and Harry Bennett and the Hunger March of 1932. It meant all of these things at the same time, in the same city, in the same summer. Eleanor was 70 years old, and she had been living inside that name for 50 years, and the name had never been a simple thing to live inside, and it was less simple now than it had ever been. The house was maintained. The art was present. Outside its windows, the city that the Ford name had helped to build was accounting, in its own violent and painful way, for the cost of how it had been built. In 1970, Eleanor Ford turned 73. She had been living in the house on Gawkler Point for 30 years, longer than she had lived anywhere else, longer than she had been married, longer than most of the institutional relationships she had built and sustained across her adult life. The house had become, in the way that long-inhabited places become, less a choice than a condition. She was in it the way she was in her own name. It had preceded her current self and would outlast it. The decision to stay in the house in Grosse Pointe Shore, inside the Ford institutional world, inside the philanthropic commitments she had built and was still maintaining, was not a decision she appears to have revisited in any documented way after Edsel's death. The staying was simply what happened. She had been formed by the world she was staying in, and the alternative to staying was a departure into a life for which her formation had not equipped her. This is not a criticism. It is a description of what decades inside a specific set of structures does to the range of options a person can practically imagine. There were, by the early 1970s, things in Eleanor's life that the decades of composed external functioning had not resolved. Her health had been intermittently fragile since the 1940s, and the fragility was increasing with age in the ordinary way that it does. Her relationships with her children were present, but carried the specific quality of relationships built across the distance that large managed households produce. Relationships in which love is assumed rather than demonstrated through the kind of sustained proximity that demonstrates it, in which the mother is a point of reference rather than a continuous presence in daily life. Henry II was running the company. Benson's life was contracting in ways that were becoming harder to ignore. William had the lions. Anne and Josephine maintained the family relationships that the occasions of a large family required. Eleanor continued to give to the Detroit Institute of Arts. She continued to make acquisitions. She continued to be present at the museum's significant events. The DIA relationship was, by this point, more than 5 decades old. It had outlasted her marriage, outlasted her father-in-law, outlasted the specific social world of Detroit's industrial aristocracy that had given it its original context. It was the most durable single commitment of her adult life, more durable than any of the other institutional relationships she had maintained. The collection at Gockler Point continued to grow, directed by Eleanor's judgment alone. She was buying with the same seriousness she had brought to collecting with Edsel, but now the decisions were entirely hers. No consultation required, no shared aesthetic to negotiate. This was the purest expression of her own taste that her life had contained. It was also the activity of a woman in her 70s, living alone in a 16,000 square foot house, acquiring objects to fill rooms that the social calendar no longer consistently filled with people. The social calendar had contracted. Grosse Pointe Shores in the 1970s was not the Grosse Pointe Shores of the 1940s, the world that had given the community its specific character. The density of prominent industrial families, the social circuits that connected them, the elaborate seasonal rhythms of dinners and events and obligations, had thinned. Some families had moved, some had died out. The social architecture of a world built around mid-century industrial wealth was eroding as that wealth dispersed, and as the industrial base that had generated it began its own long contraction. Detroit itself was accelerating into a decline that the 1967 uprising had made visible but had not initiated. The population was falling, the tax base was contracting, the schools were deteriorating. The municipal services that a city requires to function were being maintained with diminishing resources. The automobile industry that had built Detroit was building its new plants elsewhere, in suburban locations in southern states with weaker labor protections, eventually outside the country entirely. The River Rouge plant that Rivera had painted in 1932 and 1933 was still operating, but operating at a fraction of its former scale, and the workforce it employed was a fraction of what it had been at its peak. Eleanor's charitable giving to Detroit institutions continued through this period. She gave to the DIA, to hospitals, to educational institutions. The giving was sustained, and it was real, and it was directed at institutions that were themselves struggling to function in a city whose financial conditions were becoming increasingly severe. There is something in the image of a very wealthy woman in her 70s writing checks to cultural institutions, in a city that was losing its capacity to maintain basic services. Something that is not hypocrisy exactly, but that speaks to the limits of what philanthropy directed at cultural excellence can accomplish in the presence of structural collapse. The house required maintenance that was itself a significant ongoing expense. The staff required managing. The grounds required attention. The collection required conservation. The institutional infrastructure of living at the level Eleanor lived at, in a house of that scale, had not contracted with the social calendar. It continued to demand the same resources and the same organizational attention, regardless of how many people were using the spaces it maintained. What the staying had cost, accumulated over the decades, was not easily itemized. It had cost the possibility of a life organized around a different center, a life in which the Ford name and its obligations were not the primary gravitational force. It had cost the possibility of relationships built outside the social circuits that the Ford world provided and approved of. It had cost, in some harder-to-specify way, the possibility of being known primarily as something other than who she had been in relation to other people: Edsel's wife, Henry II's mother, the Ford family's cultural representative in the world of art philanthropy. These are not costs that announce themselves. They accumulate in the way that foregone possibilities accumulate, not as events, but as absences, as the gradual narrowing of what the life contains until the narrowness is so familiar that it no longer registers as a constraint. Josephine's staying had cost something similar at a scale the record makes difficult to recover precisely because the record is so thin. She had stayed inside the Ford world, inside the Grosse Pointe social geography, inside the domestic identity that her marriage and her family position had assigned her. And the staying had produced a life that the historical record describes almost entirely in terms of what she had been adjacent to, rather than what she had built or thought or felt. The adjacency was total, and the cost of it was the same kind of invisibility that the cost itself, undocumented, unrecorded, preserved only in its absence. By the mid-1970s, Eleanor was approaching 80. The house on Gawker Point had been her primary residence for 35 years. The art on its walls represented 5 decades of accumulated judgment. Outside its windows, the city that had given the Ford name its significance was becoming, with each passing year, less recognizable as the place the name had been built in. The Ford Foundation was headquartered in New York. The Ford Motor Company's center of gravity was shifting with each new plant location and each new management decision toward places that were not Detroit. The world in which Eleanor had been formed and inside which she had stayed was dissolving around the house that she had built to hold it. The staying had been a choice in the way that choices made inside total structures are choices, real enough, but made within constraints so complete that the choice and the constraint become difficult to distinguish from each other. Eleanor had stayed. The house had stayed. The art had stayed. The world the house had been built for had not. In 1976, the Detroit Institute of Arts mounted a significant exhibition drawn in part from private collections in the Detroit area. Eleanor Ford was involved in the planning as she had been involved in the DIA's planning activities for decades. She lent works from Gawker Point. She attended the opening. The museum's staff and board treated her with the deference appropriate to someone who had been one of the institution's most significant benefactors for 30 years. The exhibition was well received. The reviews noted the quality of the loans from private collections. Eleanor's name appeared in the acknowledgments. She was 79 years old. It was, in most visible respects, an occasion like the many occasions that had preceded it, another point in the long arc of her relationship with the institution, another public appearance that demonstrated the continuity of her commitment. But the DIA itself was, by 1976, operating under conditions that made the continuity of that commitment more fraught than the occasion's surface suggested. Detroit's fiscal crisis had been deepening throughout the early 1970s. The city's tax base was contracting as its population fell and as the businesses and industries that had once anchored its economy continued to relocate or contract. Municipal services were being cut. The cultural institutions that depended on a combination of municipal support and private philanthropy were navigating an environment in which both sources of funding were becoming less reliable. The DIA had reduced its hours. It had reduced its staff. It was managing its operating budget with a care that its earlier decades had not required. Eleanor's gifts to the museum, generous as they had been and continued to be, were not structured to address this kind of operating crisis. She gave collections. She gave endowment funds. She did not give in ways that addressed the museum's year-to-year operating costs, because that was not the model of philanthropic giving that her generation had practiced, or that the museum's development operations had been designed to solicit. The collections she had given were extraordinary. The museum's ability to pay its heating bills was a separate and increasingly pressing problem. This gap between the cultural legacy that a donor's gifts could build and the institutional survival that required a different kind of support was not unique to Eleanor or to the DIA. It was a structural feature of American cultural philanthropy as it had developed across the 20th century, and it was becoming visible in the 1970s with unusual clarity as the economic conditions that had made the post-war philanthropic model sustainable began to deteriorate. Henry II's public role in Detroit's institutional life had expanded in the years following the 1967 uprising, but the expansion had its own trajectory of complication. His personal life was generating press coverage that his professional life could not insulate. His second marriage had ended. His behavior within the company was producing the kind of internal tensions that eventually reached the press in the accounts of departing executives. The Iacocca situation was building toward its 1978 conclusion throughout the mid-1970s, visible to anyone inside the company as an unresolved and deteriorating relationship between two men neither of whom was willing to concede ground. Eleanor's relationship with her son during this period is not well documented in sources that are publicly available. She attended the occasions that required her attendance. She was present at the significant family events. She was his mother, and the relationship continued on those terms. Whether she had opinions about the way he was running the company, or about the way his personal life was unfolding in the press, or about the Iacocca situation as it developed, is not something she expressed in any publicly available document. The silence is familiar. Eleanor had been maintaining that quality of external composure, that refusal to allow interior experience to surface in the form of public statement, and since before her marriage. She had not commented publicly on her father-in-law's ideology. She had not commented publicly on Harry Bennett. She had not commented publicly on the labor violence of the 1930s or on the gross point-point system when it was exposed in 1945, or on the conditions in Detroit's neighborhoods in the years before the 1967 uprising. She was not going to comment now on what her son was doing with the company and the name she had worked to preserve for him. The influence that Eleanor had exercised throughout her adult life had always been of the kind that does not produce public statements. It was the influence of someone who understood the structures she was operating within, who worked through available channels rather than against them, who achieved specific outcomes, the installation of Henry II at the company, the growth of the DIA collection, the maintenance of the family's cultural standing, through sustained, quiet, institutional work. This kind of influence does not announce itself, and it does not age gracefully in the way that formal authority ages. Formal authority can be passed on. Informal influence depends on the continued functioning of the specific relationships and the specific knowledge that make it possible. And those things diminish with age in ways that cannot be managed. By the late 1970s, Eleanor's influence at the DIA, while still real, was operating in an institution that was being reshaped by forces she could not direct. New curators were arriving with different priorities. The museum's relationship to Detroit's changing demographics was producing internal conversations about what the institution was for and whom it served. The collection that Eleanor had helped build represented a specific set of aesthetic values and a specific set of collecting priorities that were not automatically continuous with what a museum serving Detroit in the late 1970s might determine it needed to be. She was not dismissed. She was not ignored. But the relationship between a major donor and the institution she has supported is never purely bilateral, and as the institution evolves in response to conditions the donor did not create and cannot control, the donor's specific vision becomes one input among many, rather than the determining force it may have been in earlier decades. Benson Ford died in 1978. He was 58 years old, and the accounts of his final years suggest a man who had not found a sustainable relationship with the world he had been born into, whose position inside the Ford name had been neither close enough to genuine institutional authority to be satisfying nor distant enough from it to allow the development of something genuinely independent. He had been in the family's internal geography between the positions that had coherent definitions. Henry II ran the company. William had the lions. Benson had the name and a series of roles that were adjacent to significance without being inside it. Eleanor had 4 children when Edsel died in 1943. By 1978, one of them was gone. She was 81 years old. The house on Gawkler Point still held the art. The DIA relationship continued. The checks were still being written to the institutions she had supported for decades. But the world in which those institutions had their original meaning was contracting around her with a speed and a thoroughness that philanthropy could not address and composure could not prevent. Henry II retired from the Ford Motor Company in 1979, after 34 years as its president and chief executive. The retirement was not entirely voluntary. The board had been managing a transition for several years, and Henry's personal life and management style had created institutional pressures that made a clean departure the preferred outcome for multiple parties. He was 61 years old. The company continued without him, as it had continued without his grandfather and without his father. Eleanor was 82. She had now watched 3 generations of Ford men defined by and then separated from the company that bore their name. The separations had different characters. Edsel's had been the separation of death preceded by systematic diminishment. Henry Sr.'s had been the separation of cognitive deterioration and institutional necessity. Henry II's was the separation of institutional politics and personal complexity. But the pattern was consistent. The company outlasted the men. The name outlasted its bearers. And Eleanor, who had organized significant portions of her adult life around ensuring the continuity of that name, was still present to observe what the continuity actually looked like from the inside. Eleanor Ford died on October 19th, 1976. She was 79 years old. This is incorrect. The available historical record places Eleanor Ford's death in 1976, but subsequent research has clarified that she died on October 19th, 1976, a date that several sources confirm. However, some accounts place her death in a different year, and the precise details require care. Let us be accurate. Eleanor Clay Ford died on October 19, 1976, at the age of 79. The house on Gawkler Point did not immediately become anything. That is the first thing to understand about what happened to it. Large houses belonging to prominent families do not transform themselves cleanly into their next incarnation the moment their primary occupant dies. They sit, they are administered, lawyers are involved, family members discuss. The machinery of estate management operates at its own pace, which has nothing to do with the emotional pace of loss or the institutional pace of cultural history. Eleanor had been thinking about the house's future for years before her death. The collection it contained was significant enough that its disposition required serious planning. The house itself was large enough and architecturally significant enough that its simple sale to a private buyer would have represented a kind of erasure, the dissolution of something that had been built with a specific and coherent intention into whatever a private purchaser's preferences might make of it. Eleanor had not built the house to be dissolved. She left the house and its contents to a foundation, the Eleanor and Edsel Ford House, which would eventually open to the public as a historic house museum. This was a considered decision, made by a woman who understood institutional structures well enough to know that a foundation was a more reliable mechanism for preservation than a family's continued private ownership. The family had other priorities. The house needed a custodian whose primary purpose was the house itself. What the foundation inherited was not only a house and a collection, it inherited the maintenance costs of a 16,000 square foot Georgian revival structure on Prime Lake, St. Clair shoreline, the conservation costs of a significant art collection, the operational costs of running a historic house museum in a metropolitan area whose cultural tourism infrastructure was being shaped by the same economic conditions that were reshaping everything else about Detroit, and the institutional challenge of making a wealthy family's private domestic environment legible and meaningful to a public that had no particular personal connection to the family. Historic house museums occupy a strange position in the cultural landscape. They preserve the material evidence of lives lived at a specific level of privilege, and they ask their visitors to find that preservation meaningful, to experience the rooms and the objects and the organization of the space as something more than the documentary residue of wealth. The best of them manage this because the lives they document were genuinely interesting in ways that the material culture can illuminate. The ones that struggle are the ones whose primary claim on the visitor's attention is the fact of the wealth itself, rather than anything the wealth produced or enabled that has continuing relevance. The Ford House, as it came to be known, has functioned as a public institution for decades. It is maintained. It is open to visitors. It offers tours. The art, not all of it, but the pieces retained in the house, is visible to people who would not otherwise have access to it. This is not nothing, but the institution has also operated in the shadow of the same challenges that every historic house museum in a declining industrial city faces. The challenge of relevance, of audience development, of financial sustainability in an environment where cultural philanthropy is always competing with more urgent claims on available resources. The Grosse Pointe Shores location, which had been the point in Eleanor's lifetime, the deliberate establishment of distance from Detroit's industrial and working-class neighborhoods, became, after her death, a complication for the institution that inherited her house. The house was not easy to reach without a car. The community it sat in was not a natural destination for the broad Detroit area public the museum needed to attract. The very geography that had defined the house's meaning as a private residence created obstacles for its functioning and as a public institution. Fair Lane. The estate Henry Ford had built at Dearborn in 1915, the house Josephine had grown up in, had its own institutional history after Henry's death that illustrated, with different specifics, the same basic problem. The University of Michigan's Dearborn campus acquired the property and used it for various purposes across the subsequent decades. It was opened for tours. It was maintained imperfectly and with chronic underfunding as a historic site. It was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. It deteriorated. Pipes froze. Ceilings developed water damage. The power plant Henry had built with such specificity of intention sat unused and slowly decaying. The university eventually undertook a major restoration effort funded by a combination of institutional resources and private donations, including from Ford family members and Ford Motor Company. The restoration is ongoing. The house that Henry Ford built to express his specific vision of what a home should be has spent decades after his death being rescued, repeatedly, from the consequences of nobody being quite certain what to do with it. Josephine's estate, her household, her possessions, the domestic world she had maintained for 4 decades, generated no equivalent institutional history. There was no historic house foundation. There was no museum. The contents were dispersed in the way that the contents of private households are dispersed when the person who organized them is gone, through family distribution, through sale, through the ordinary processes by which a life's accumulated objects re-enter the world as individual items rather than as a coherent whole. The documentary record of what Josephine's household contained, how it was organized, what it expressed about the person who inhabited it, is not something that was preserved in any systematic way. This is the fate of most lives, including most wealthy lives. The institutional preservation that Eleanor's house received was unusual. It required a specific combination of architectural significance, collection quality, family decision-making, and foundation formation that most estates do not produce. Josephine's life, which had been organized around domestic and social functions, rather than around the kind of cultural institution building that generates preservation impulses, dissolved into the general record the way that most lives dissolve, leaving traces, but not monuments. Henry II died in September of 1987. He was 70 years old. The obituaries were extensive and serious in their engagement with his legacy. The rebuilding of the company after the Bennett years, the management innovations of the late 1940s and 1950s, the failures and excesses of the later decades, the complex personal history. The coverage was of a man who had run a major institution for 3 decades and whose running of it had produced consequences, good and bad, lasting and temporary, that were worth serious accounting. Eleanor's obituaries, when they had come 11 years earlier, were respectful and warm and focused primarily on her philanthropic contributions and her role as Edsel's wife and Henry II's mother. The DIA was mentioned. The collection was mentioned. The family relationships were enumerated. The accounting that Eleanor's life deserved, the accounting of what she had built and what it had cost and what had been done with it, was not something the obituary form was designed to produce. The house on Gawkler Point sits on its stretch of Lake St. Clair shoreline. It is maintained. Its rooms are organized as they were in Eleanor's lifetime, as closely as the historical record and the available objects allow. Visitors move through it on scheduled tours and look at the paintings on the walls and the furniture in its rooms and the view from its windows toward the lake, and the house holds all of it. The art, the architecture, the accumulated weight of 5 decades of a life organized around its maintenance, with the same quality of composed, well-lit silence that it held when Eleanor was alive. The Detroit Institute of Arts came close to selling its collection in 2013. The city of Detroit had filed for bankruptcy in July of that year, the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history at that point. The city's pension obligations, its bond debt, and its contracted operating costs had outrun its revenue by a margin that years of management, borrowing, and deferred maintenance had made unresolvable through ordinary means. The emergency manager appointed to oversee the bankruptcy process commissioned an appraisal of the DIA's collection, which the city technically owned, to determine whether the assets could be liquidated to satisfy creditors. The appraisal valued the collection at between $200 and $800 million, depending on methodology. The works that Eleanor Ford had donated across 5 decades, the Dutch masters, The French Impressionists, the American paintings she had chosen with the same seriousness she had brought to everything she had built, were among the assets under consideration. The possibility that they would be dispersed to private buyers, removed from the public institution she had spent her adult life building, removed from Detroit entirely, was real and documented and seriously discussed by the lawyers and financial advisors managing the bankruptcy proceedings. The collection was ultimately protected through a settlement arrangement that became known as the Grand Bargain, a negotiated resolution that involved the DIA, the state of Michigan, and a group of private foundations, contributing funds to satisfy pension obligations in exchange for the museum's separation from city ownership and the permanent protection of its collection. The Eleanor Ford donations were not sold. They remained in the museum. The Grand Bargain was widely described as a creative and successful resolution to an unprecedented crisis. It was also a resolution that illustrated, with the kind of clarity that only genuine crises produce, the fragility of the institutional structures that Eleanor's philanthropy had been directed toward for 50 years. The DIA's collection had been built, in significant part, through the generosity of Detroit's industrial families. The city that housed the museum had been built, in significant part, through the industrial practices of those same families. The bankruptcy that threatened the collection had been produced by the city's decades-long contraction, which was itself the consequence of the industrial disinvestment and demographic transformation that the same family's residential and business decisions had helped to accelerate. The Grand Bargain resolved the immediate crisis without requiring anyone to account for this circularity. Eleanor had been dead for 37 years when the bankruptcy was filed. Josephine had been dead for 49 years. The decisions that had shaped Detroit's trajectory in the second half of the 20th century had been made by people who were also, in many cases, dead. By city administrators and federal housing officials and automotive executives and banking institutions and real estate developers whose individual choices had accumulated into conditions that no individual had chosen and no individual could undo. This is how structural history works. It does not require villains. It requires accumulated decisions made inside systems that reward certain choices and punish others. And it produces consequences that arrive long after the people who made the choices are no longer present to observe them. The Ford House in Grosse Pointe Shores continued to operate as a historic house museum. It received a significant restoration grant in the early 2000s that allowed major maintenance work to be completed. The grounds were restored, the house's systems were updated, the collection was conserved. The institution that Eleanor had established to preserve her house and its contents was functioning, with the limitations and the challenges that all such institutions face, as a going concern. Visitors to the Ford House moved through rooms that were organized by a woman who spent 50 years developing a coherent aesthetic vision and then used a house to express it. The rooms are good. The collection is good. The view from the lakeside windows is the same view Eleanor had from those windows, across the same water, toward the same Canadian shoreline. The house holds what it holds, and what it holds is real, and not a performance of taste, but actual taste, not an imitation of cultural seriousness, but the material evidence of it. What the house does not hold, and cannot hold, is the cost of what it took to build it. The labor history that funded the collection is not present in the rooms. The ideology of the family whose name the house carries is not present in the rooms. The Grosse Pointe point system and its relationship to the neighborhood the house sits in is not present in the rooms. The sustained invisible work of the woman who managed the household and organized the philanthropic commitments and installed her son at the company and maintained the composed external surface across 4 decades of widowhood. That is not present in the rooms either, or not in any form that announces itself. What remains of Josephine Ford is less. Her name appears in the family histories. Her birth and death dates are recorded. Her marriage is documented. Her children are named. The outlines of a life are present in the record, and the interiority of that life and what she thought, what she wanted, what the decades felt like from inside them, is not recoverable from what the archive preserves. Henry II's legacy is complicated in the way that the legacies of powerful institutional figures are always complicated. real achievements alongside real failures, genuine ability alongside genuine cruelty, a company rebuilt, and a company whose subsequent decades produced their own sequence of crises and recoveries. He is remembered as the man who saved Ford from Harry Bennett. He is also remembered as the man who fired Lee Iacocca because he didn't like him. Both memories are accurate. Neither exhausts the account. The Rivera murals are still on the walls of the Detroit Institute of Art's courtyard. They depict Ford workers at the River Rouge plant with a specificity and seriousness that the passage of 90 years has not diminished. The men in the murals are not abstractions. They are people. They are doing work. The conditions of that work and the conditions of the neighborhoods they return to after doing it are not depicted in the murals. Rivera painted the labor, not the life around the labor, but the presence of the workers themselves, rendered with that specificity in a museum built partly with Ford family money, in a city built partly by Ford family decisions, is a fact that the building continues to hold without resolving. Eleanor Ford's name is on the wall of the Detroit Institute of Arts. It will remain there. The objects she gave will remain in the museum's collection, available to people who know her name and people who do not, valuable regardless of the circumstances of their acquisition, beautiful regardless of the history they carry. Josephine Ford's name is not on the wall of the Detroit Institute of Arts. It is not on the wall of any major institution. It is in the family record and in the social registers of mid-20th century Detroit, and in the kind of documentation that survives because it was attached to a significant surname rather than because it recorded anything the woman herself had built. The Ford name continues. The company continues, producing automobiles and plants whose locations trace the full arc of American industrial geography. The original Midwest, the Union-resistant South, the global supply chains that connect Detroit to places Henry Ford could not have imagined and would not have approved of. The name on the cars is the same name that was on the door of Fair Lane in 1915 and on the gate of Gockler Point in 1940 and on the donor wall of the DIA in 1946. What the name covers and what it does not cover and what was quietly spent in its maintenance. That is not something the name itself records. There is a room in the Ford house on Gockler Point where the light comes off the lake in the late afternoon and falls across the paintings on the walls at an angle that changes their color slightly, deepens some, flattens others, in a way that Eleanor Ford would have known because she lived with that light for 35 years, and she was someone who paid attention to such things. The room holds what she put in it. The light does what it does. Nobody who comes through on a scheduled tour knew her. This is the ordinary condition of preserved houses. The rooms outlast the person. The objects outlast the relationships that surrounded them. The institutional structure that was built to maintain the place continues to maintain it, with varying resources and varying success, long after the reasons the place was built have receded into history. What is less ordinary about the Ford house is the distance between what the rooms contain and what produced them. The collection is genuine. The aesthetic vision is coherent and serious. The house is, by any reasonable measure, a significant cultural artifact, not because of the name attached to it, but because of the judgment it expresses. Eleanor Ford spent 50 years developing that judgment, and the house is its most complete material expression. And yet, the house sits in Grosse Pointe Shores. The name on its donor wall at the DIA is the same name that was on the Dearborn Independent. The collection was funded by the same accumulation that employed Harry Bennett and opposed the unionization of the River Rouge plant, and served unpasteurized milk to Edsel Ford, and contributed, through the specific mechanisms of industrial and residential decision-making, to the conditions that produced Detroit's 2013 bankruptcy. None of this cancels the paintings. None of it requires the paintings to be removed from the walls, or the house to be closed to visitors, or Eleanor's genuine aesthetic achievement to be retroactively diminished. These things are simply also true, simultaneously, in the same building. Josephine Ford left no building. She left the outline of a life that the archive describes in relational terms: daughter, sister, wife, mother, without the interior of that life being recoverable from what was preserved. She was a Ford. That was the primary fact the record attached to her. What it felt like to be that fact, from the inside, across 64 years in the middle of the 20th century, in the middle of one of the most complicated family stories American industrial history produced, is something that died with her and was not recorded before it did. The question the archive leaves open is not whether these women were good or bad, successful or failed, admirable or complicit. It is a simpler and harder question than that. It is the question of what a life organized entirely around a name, around the maintenance of that name, the performance of that name, the transmission of that name to the next generation, actually contains. What is left when the name is the container and the container is what persists, and the person who lived inside it is what does not. The light comes off the lake in the late afternoon. The paintings hold their color. The house continues.